having all of us here, and I believe that Geoff came up with the title of what we're talking about, beauty, as an act of resistance. And we know each other pretty well, and so I think he's pitched this one to me intentionally. What I'd like to do is have each of the panelists, Steve, Rick, Lee, and Andrew, go through, it doesn't matter the order, you can choose yourselves, but if you can, describe your work. But I would like for each of you, as Andres has said to us, we have to look 25 years into the future, and our value is there. Well, I'll be about 85 then. And so I want to know if each of you think, is it worth it? Who goes first?
I'll go first.
All right.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Rodney, for being here and being my provocateur for this evening. And thank you, Vince and Geoff, for putting this together. As I said to some of the folks early on, my name is Lee Pringle, and I'm the black mayor of this town. That's a joke. I'm one of those who was sitting in the Ashley House condominiums on Lockwood Drive looking out at the rice mill building and thumbing through the Post and Courier real estate because I was at the time working for the New York home office of MetLife and had gotten enough bonuses I could put a down payment on a house. And so a friend of mine who was someone who sang with me in the Charleston Symphony Chorus was a real estate agent. I said, hey, can you carve out some time and take me around downtown? I really want to stay in the peninsula to find a house. And I said, by the way, I saw this article, which was Geoff's original house, and the East Lake house with the cupola on the top. And it looked really, really charming. So we came in to Ion. There was no square. There was, I think East Lake didn't even go beyond Pression Street. And you could get to, is it Grace Lane? Grace Lane. And there were, some builders who were, I know, I keep telling people I'm royalty. They need to, make sure they address me accordingly. So I said to my friend, so what are the houses selling for on Civitas? Because they were kind of shotgun and they were elevated. And I said, and the one that you showed me at lot 27, that's the same price? And I go, all right, this is me wanting to be an architect, and I was thinking about the square footage and visualizing. I said, I want to put a contract on this house. He goes, but you hadn't seen the rest of the neighborhood yet. I said, no, I've done a little bit of tabulating in my head, and I think for the square footage here, this is a pretty good deal. So I used that story to talk about being a visionary and having the ability to see beyond the trees. And I knew nothing about who Vince Graham was, Geoff, or their father, Tom. All I knew is everything I looked at downtown in 1989 needed $200,000 worth of work. And I could get a brand new house for the same amount of money. And so I subsequently moved into the house. Long story short, I go to Charlotte. I work for T.I. Cref when they opened their offices there for 8 years. And I would not sell my house. I put the alarm on. I'd come back maybe once a month. And I had friends emailing me and saying, have you heard what's going on in that neighborhood that you live in? You have that house in Charleston? And I go, no, I have no idea. And they go, you might want to look at what the lots are selling for. And so because I understood from the master plan that what Vince had envisioned, once it matured, it was going to be a pretty darn neat place to live in. And I don't know how far I'm going off of the outline of what Rodney's going to engage us to do, but I certainly...
I understand you're a musician.
I'm a musician, I'm going to get to that.
Okay.
So I met Rodney in 2018 when I left the corporate world after 25 years and started a nonprofit called the Color of Music Festival. It's a Black classical musicians festival whose mission is to give conservatory-trained artists a platform to not only perform the white European canon that they train for in conservatory, but they get to also perform Black composers' works who get very little notoriety, in particular Black women. And so it was a bold idea. I put the word Black in our logo. I had funders who would sit down with me and say, Lee, this is a nice idea, but you got to take the word Black out or no one's going to give you money. And I would say, thank you for your opinion, but I'm leaving the word Black in. And so fast forward, we're doing a presentation through the Buckhead Cascade Links chapter, Links Incorporated chapter. The woman who was the president was very good friends with the King family. She was a Spelman alum. And they wanted us to do a presentation at Sisters Chapel. So if you know anything about the AUC in Atlanta, Sisters Chapel is where all those iconic life photographs of the wake of Dr. King's week of mourning, those pictures were taken there. So there's a plaque in the front of Sisters Chapel that actually states this is where Dr. King's body laid and reposed, et cetera, et cetera. So we did this performance, and as a lead-in, Vince says, hey man, if you're gonna be in Atlanta, you gotta meet my friend Rodney. He's a historian and he's someone that I think you guys should meet each other. So I went in, I met Rodney. Rodney popped a cork of red wine, we talked, and my videographer and I had made some beautiful B-roll that we have somewhere on our Vimeo site. That's how far back it goes, of the Artisan Museum, which leads into how I transitioned from corporate financial services, corporate marketing, into envisioning something that was outside of the box, which I think is very apropos for the vision of Vince and his brother and his dad, to create something that is not only the most wonderful place to live in the Tri-County area, but a showpiece for how village living can coexist among the monstrosities that are in the traditional neighborhood. So that's my story, and I'm sticking with it.
You know, I'm gonna. Well, let me just say this. I'm technically an architect, although the last job I did was 6 years ago in urbanist and mainly write books and stuff now. My act of resistance this evening it is actually to say that, and I'm just laying this out there. If anybody's interested, then we can talk, later in the program. But is to say that actually beauty is not the standard that should be used. Now, Wanda can tell you that wherever she is, here she is. She can tell you that actually this is, some of y'all think you've heard this before, that this is actually a new material that nobody's heard except Wanda. Anyhow, I'll just leave it at that, and we can move on.
Gould. I do traditional architectural design. I'm based in downtown Charleston, and I have two specialties: Eastern Orthodox churches, which I do all over the country and abroad, and I specialize in infill developments in downtown Charleston, one of which you'll see tomorrow on the tour. You've already seen the church up the street, and well, I don't feel like I need to show you a slideshow of my work or anything, because you're in it all week long. I designed all this paneling that you see around you, and when we go over to the restaurant for dinner tonight, I designed all the paneling in there as well. Vince has been very good to me in hiring me to do some rather splendid beautification here in Ion and at his house, Mugdock Castle, where we were last night. So I would say I've been riding a wave of good fortune for the past 18 years, ever since I arrived here in Charleston, and have had some rather visionary clients who take advantage of my skills to produce beautiful things.
Hi, I'm Rick Harden. I'm a neighbor of Andrew's and of Vince's, and I probably shouldn't be here. When I heard the level of the conversation starting at 1:15 today, I went up to Geoff and to Vince and I said, is there any way I can recuse myself from involvement here? Because yeah, really? All right. That's good. I feel better already. And you made me feel better too.
Well, I think other than Andrew, that everybody else up here may have a bit of imposter syndrome going on.
Whoa. You're talking about us, or are you talking about them, the
No,
people?
I'm talking about us.
Oh,
But from what you said, I don't know. Anyhow, go ahead. Sorry.
Vince said, the hell you're not going to recuse yourself from this because you have some good stuff you need to say as someone who makes shit. So I guess I'm one of the people that actually puts stuff together. And sometimes it's been Andrew's stuff. Andrew designs very beautiful things, and then Andrew goes, now who could build this? And so sometimes I've been the lucky beneficiary of his amazing designs. And so this is going to be unexpected right now. Just to tell you, if I get a chance to speak anymore, what I want to talk about is resistance against what we are resisting as makers of things on a small scale. And I'm just me. I have a couple studios. I work around town. I'm just making small stuff. The background to that is not going to be what you expect. I did do lots of art school, have advanced degree in art. I taught for 24 years at a college. But what formed me, I think, the most in terms of my understanding of the ugliness that we resist as artists and creators was formed in conflict zones around the world. I traveled and worked in Berlin during the opening of the Berlin Wall. I was in Poland during martial law in the early 80s. I've worked in Palestine, Darfur, a lot in Bosnia, Kosovo during the war, Albania. Pardon me? As an artist. I'm sorry, I didn't even introduce myself as an artist. I went as an artist believing that we need to see some of the most important current events going on through the eyes of people other than statesmen and journalists, thinking that maybe an artist would have something to say. Because if you look at the history of art about conflict or other very important global issues, the art, the movies, the books usually come 10 to 20 years later. Look at the plethora of books right now about World War II. People are fascinated by something that happened 75 years ago. My thesis, which I don't know how it's proved itself, was that artists should be there also and document, record, interpret what was happening. Here's the short of it. What I found out is that the problem with ugliness is people, that people really are the problem. I guess I'm referring back to a statement that was made earlier today, that there's something about the human heart, damaged condition that I think it's in, that's really a spiritual problem. And that ugliness flows from a spiritual emptiness.
Thanks. Okay, so I'd like to run through some of the things that we do at my foundation. We're called the National Monuments Foundation. We do things around the world, but the International Monuments Foundation didn't suit us. And so here is a thing that we are working on now, and in that we are specialists in monuments which are all-encompassing. It's not just statue sculpture, it's also buildings. And we tend to only deal with things that have high symbolic resonance in whatever country we're working. This is a hot spot in my state currently. This is Stone Mountain. And so you have the largest bas-relief in the world that has Robert E. Lee in the center, Stonewall Jackson, and Jefferson Davis. The state of Georgia controls this. It's a state park. There are numbers of people who want to blast it off the mountain. Borglum did this, and he started this initially before he went on to Mount Rushmore. You can see there's a 15-story tower on the top, and one of the things that we are all about is adding. You never subtract. You're no better than the Soviets or the communist Chinese if you do that. History is messy. It happened, and so you have to remember it, or we are going to continue to repeat it. And so what we've put there is a giant carillon. And one of the most famous speeches of Dr. King, who was a close friend of my father, was let the freedom ring from the Stone Mountain of Georgia. You will hear that bell all the way to Emory University. And we also have worked around the world in restorations. This was the scene I saw when I first entered Istra. This is the New Jerusalem Monastery and the Resurrection Cathedral. It was badly damaged by the Nazis, and Secretary Brezhnev put this roof on it to protect it. This is what we did to it after I had launched a speech at the Russian embassy in Washington years ago. More work that we did in Scandinavia. This is Ledreborg Palace, about 25 miles out of Copenhagen, and this is what it looks like now. And then probably the largest mistake of my life, this is the Konstantinovsky Palace at Strelna, not in very good shape. We were able to acquire that, 1,000 hectares, numbers of buildings. We got part of it restored. This is the way it looks today. Sadly, it was taken from me, so it was a big loss. Never go there again for a while. This is a park that my family built in the 19th century called Mims Park. It's an Olmsted design. It was about 5-6 acres, and over the 20th century, the green there in the middle was allowed to take a school. And so the school over the 20th century got bigger and overtook the park. My father, I'm privileged to be the son of a great man, and he had told me that I build stuff like that, and so I should put it back, and that was a community that had always, he was a public official, and that community had always given him, he said, 87% of the vote, not 85, not 87% of the vote. And then he died. And so any Georgia boy that has that kind of command from a father, he is not going to stop until he finishes. And so this is the park now. The school still exists, and it's adjacent to this park. And Mayor Reed gave us 20 acres, so everything grew in volume and scale to accommodate a 21st century impression of the 19th century Olmsted plan. We have already, we're trying to put as many statues up as people are pulling down as fast as we can. And Congressman John Lewis opened our headquarters, Millennium Gate, in 2008, and he was also a good friend of my dad and me. He got cancer, as we all know, and we didn't expect that. And so we rushed this statue, and I called him and said, will you please help us, because we want to make sure that you like it. And he did, and he was moved to tears. Actually, when it was finished, he told the Atlanta Constitution he felt he was looking in the mirror. And then just a few months ago, Ambassador Andrew Young, who co-chairs the rebuilding of this park with me, actually beat my father for Congress. And they were great friends before and after, and Dad even took me to volunteer for Andy when I was 12. And I lick stamps and fetch coffee. They did not expect to run against each other later in their careers, but it happened. The body language of the two men is quite extraordinary. It's like they're the best of friends, and they would go out and get a beer with each other afterwards. Of course, Andy went on to Congress, he won, and Dad went back into the State House and ran the Republican Party for 20 years. And retired to the mountains of North Carolina. He didn't think anybody would remember him. And I'll show you a sort of ironic thing at the end of this. They certainly did. He instructed me in his papers that if Ambassador Young survived him, if he could do the eulogy at his funeral. This is the man that beat him for Congress. Andy did the eulogy for 30 minutes with no notes. We call that the Atlanta way. Ellen knows all about it. And so this is a monument to the Olympic Games that the Prince of Wales, now King Charles III, gave our state for the 1996 Olympic Games. I'm friendly with the new king, and he asked me recently, because of the knowledge that the same thing was happening to his monument that happened when Diana, Princess of Wales, had died, and flowers and teddy bears and all sorts of things were piling up on the monument. And so he compelled me to do the same thing I did for her, and there were 30,000 people then. There were several thousand people for the Queen just a few weeks ago, but we broadcast live the entire event from London, start to finish, on a jumbotron. The mayor allowed half of Peachtree, this is on our main street, to be closed, and the building was draped in funereal swags, as you see, and packed with flowers. This is our primary headquarters, the Millennium Gate Museum. We're a Georgia history museum and a triumphal arch based on the Arch of Titus. The recent acquisition that we just have done is our co-founder, Chief Tomochichi, a Savannah fellow who allowed General Oglethorpe, our other co-founder, to create the great Oglethorpe Plan, and that is now called Savannah. Without the help of Tomochichi, it would never have been built. This is our headquarters. Just a week or so ago, we also draped it in honor of Queen Elizabeth with the drapery at the top and the Union Jack. This was yesterday. We have just had the Hungarian freedom fighter statue commemorated. This is their ambassador. Thousands of people came again, and Vince and Geoff were good to let me get into the house at Mugdock Castle. Yesterday I got there a little bit early because I left this as fast as I could to come to see you guys. It is socialist realism. I don't know if you can see the statue closely enough, but our foundation, we press buttons and we try to stir folks, and this is done in the style that everyone saw in Eastern Europe and Russia for decades. And it is classically oriented, but it's usually Stalin or Lenin sneering at you in this style, and it's all about terrifying the people. We turned it on its head. This is loosely based on the child, Erika Zeles, who was furious that she was not free, and so she joined in with the great Hungarian uprising in 1956. Her picture was taken by the Danish photographer Hansen, and it is striking, and her fury and her poise and her dedication to freedom was so clearly etched on her face, and it graced the cover of most every major magazine in the world. Sadly, by that time, she had been killed. This is the way that most of you probably think of my city. It's a gigantic parking lot. It's supposed to move, but it doesn't that much. And as I mentioned to you, and as I've said in my first question to my fine panelists, is it all worth it? And I said to you that I am the son of a great man, and they tend to name funny things after him, and so this is one of them. And I don't know what to do with this honor, but there is actually a picture with my children, his grandchildren, and we're under that sign, and we're all in various states of horror and terror. So what I'd like to do is pitch it. First, Lee, you are one of the longest reigning residents of Ion. I've already heard you say you're the black mayor of Ion. This place is about as white bread as you can get. Why are you still here?
Well, I find it hilarious that we can bring levity to being a pioneer when, you've been colonized. But, hey, what makes American history unique, and I'm on the board of the Middleton Place Foundation. I'm a 7th generation Pringle who is directly connected to Arthur Middleton, who was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, if you all you history buffs out there. And, when I am asked to be on boards, I'm very careful that I only commit my personal time to things that I really believe in. And I really believe in telling the true history of the evolution of this great country. I'm an 8-year veteran of the U.S. Navy and Did 5 years at sea making circles in the Indian Ocean twice, 64 days at one time and 62 days. So if you've ever had powdered milk and no lettuce for days on end, you know what that feels like. So I have a different perspective as a black liberal who has a conservative streak when it comes to certain things in my life, but a very liberal streak when it comes to other things in my life. And I do think that they can coexist. And because I believe in the historic nature of living, staying in this place, I often say the Ravenel Bridge is my happy bridge, because it can be pouring down raining, but the majestic aspects of the wishbone design, and wanted to be an architect, but didn't go that route. I have this appreciation for the thought that goes into creating 856, I think, lot, neighborhood that is everything I imagine I would put my stake down. And as I tell my nieces and nephew, y'all gonna take me out of the house sideways from here. So when I was jokingly saying to one of the fellow panelists before we spoke, I said, I'm like a lot of black folks, you give us that property, we're not leaving. And so it's a pleasure to come home every day at any entrance in this wonderful neighborhood. And as someone who, again, can see the forest beyond the trees, I have a huge appreciation for people who make bold statements that are not always easy for people to digest. And if you know anything about the history of this neighborhood, boy, from council members losing their seats to people protesting the first traffic circle to, just a whole plethora of things. And so, Rodney, I hope I didn't go too far off your question. That's why I'm still here.
All right. Andrew and Steve, Vince has said earlier that he could not build Ion today. Such beauty and excellence that this place is, that's a difficult statement that he made. I would like for the two of you to talk about your work and how that is embraced by developers so that it makes jobs for guys like Vince easier. Steve, you go first. I'm sorry, Andrew, you go first. Sorry. Yes, you should. Whatever you want.
If you could bring up the other PowerPoint now.
Do you want the podium?
Sure.
All right.
So I'll start out by talking about something a little different before I get to my work. So Vince asked me to speak on this topic of beauty as an act of resistance. And I was trying to think, how should I frame this? Resistance to what exactly? And I think I'm going to put it very broadly as basically resistance to all of the comforts of the world, all the inertia of doing things the easy way that results in mediocrity. And I'd like to start by looking at where in the world do we see the densest concentration of beauty, the most overwhelming and extraordinary beauty. And I would submit that one place that we see that is in monasticism, oddly enough. It seems paradoxical, but the monks who have left the world in order to live a life of self-denial are surrounded by the most extraordinary density of beauty of any architectural spaces that you could find. So here we have on Mount Athos in Greece, men who have essentially forsaken the world. They live on an island, minimal modern conveniences, they hardly eat anything, they get maybe 3 hours of sleep a day, they're in church often 8 or 10 hours a day, a life of extraordinary hardship, and yet it's a life absolutely saturated with sumptuous aesthetic beauty. Isn't that curious that this beauty seems to inevitably flow out of that life of hard self-denial. Some of these things they make themselves. Some of these beautiful things are gifts from pilgrims and patrons who leave things at the monastery as a sort of way of expiating their own sins. And so at this place of denial, extraordinary beauty flowers. And of course, this is not limited to Eastern Orthodoxy. We see this in monastic traditions worldwide. Tibetan Buddhism, Sufi Islam, for instance, we see a similar phenomenon. But I said earlier, the correct ordering of the transcendentals is not that beauty follows goodness, but rather that beauty comes first. And it's important to remember that, because where else do we see extraordinary concentrations of beauty? The interior spaces of tyrants. Here we have the palace of the Medicis in Florence, the ducal palace in Venice, Hampton Court Palace, house of Henry VIII. So the tyrants of the world, the people who are essentially the most successful pirates, who steal wealth from everybody else, they too manage to accumulate this incredible concentration of beauty, and likewise would live a life of order and ceremony, wearing beautiful robes, every aesthetic matter attended to perfection. So I think it's clear that beauty does not flow from goodness. So what does it flow from? It seems to flow from sort of brute force. There's a wonderful passage in the Bible where Jesus says, "The kingdom of heaven suffereth violence, and the violence take it by force." Well, beauty is understood, at least in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, as iconic of the kingdom of heaven. Anything here on earth that is beautiful is here to point us to heaven. And the monks of Mount Athos, they are doing what Jesus commanded. They are working as hard as humanly possible, in a sense taking the kingdom of heaven by force, just as these tyrants are taking that beauty that belongs to the kingdom of heaven by force, and thereby achieving that heavenly beauty in their earthly palaces. Another place that we see great beauty is pastoral life, the sort of traditional rustic life of primitive people, and the beauty of rustic life has been understood to be in some ways the equal of the beauty of aristocratic or monastic life for many centuries. We see these old paintings that exalt the beauty of the pastoral condition. And why is there such beauty here? Well, because that too is a hard life. It's the life of subsistence farmers, the life of abject poverty, and at least in a traditionally ordered society, tremendous beauty can flourish in that context too. Whereas starting hundreds of years ago, people started to recognize that the great enemy of beauty was neither wealth nor poverty, but the bourgeoisie. It was the people who had it easy, who didn't work too terribly hard at anything, the people who were mere business owners, the people who couldn't afford the sort of splendors of the aristocracy, but wanted to imitate it, so they would buy the half-priced version at a store and sort of be pretend aristocrats. This in many ways is where modern ugliness entered the world, is with the middle class. And indeed, to this day, it is the middle class that seems to be the primary driver of ugliness. It's the comfortable life of the suburbs, where you don't have to sort of take sides. You don't have to affiliate. You don't have to become either a monk or a pirate. You can just kind of take it easy in between. And that seems to be the way of life that naturally produces suburban sprawl, houses that are painted completely white inside and out, where essentially everything is bland and boring. There's a passage in Dante where, as Dante is beginning his descent into the Inferno, being taken on a tour by Virgil, he sees a cavern full of people who are particularly miserable, and he's told that these are the people who are condemned by Jesus as being neither hot nor cold, neither serving God nor serving the devil, and therefore neither heaven nor hell will accept them. And Virgil says that that is the worst fate that can befall man. It's even worse than damnation. And I think this is sort of one way we can see people trapped in this endless cycle of suburban consumerism, even though every scientific statistic tells those people that they're overworked and miserable and that almost any other way of life would make them happier. They're trapped there because they refuse to affiliate, as it were. They refuse to make that effort to stand for beauty, whether it's a sort of holy beauty or an unholy beauty. They won't go to either one. So I kind of see beauty as an act of resistance to the easy path, because beauty is always hard. I've spent my career trying to build places that are uncommonly beautiful. This is one of my little pocket neighborhoods in downtown Charleston. Not the one we're going to see tomorrow, but another one off of St. Philip Street that's just wrapping up construction right now. And to build this kind of beauty, even though it's sort of a simple old-fashioned beauty that might have been unremarkable 100 years ago, it requires tremendous resistance to the easy path. Almost every building code, every zoning code, every bureaucratic regulation, every economic force of the real estate market, every standard of the construction industry is against everything you see here. And so it is like act of continuous sort of force and suffering to make this happen. And I'm prepared to celebrate that, because that makes me feel like, in a way, I'm right there on Mount Athos with those monks. They're suffering for beauty, and you know, I think that's probably how it always has been, and how it always will be. Thank you.
Thank you. Rick, your turn. You may do whatever you want.
As I mentioned, I was a teacher for 24 years, but not really an academic, and I think that's what caused me to panic and want to flee at 1:15 when I started listening to superb academics. But I am comfortable sharing my ideas, and I did teach painting and drawing and the philosophies of modern art for many years, and I'm going to just say something that I think is the enemy that I've been resisting, partly through teaching my students to think more broadly, partly in the things that I've undertaken to build in my own life, to bring into the world beautiful things I've thought should be in the world, and that is the enemy is modernism. And the roots of modernism is an overreach of rationality. And I feel strongly that what the world needs, what we need as creators, is a healthy dose of re-enchantment, to believe that the universe is not just facts, it's not just cause and effect, it is not cold and only function, that there is an enchanted realm that's transcendent, it's beyond. You might call me a deist. If I mention the soul, you'll think I'm a heretic. But I feel like these are some of the things that have resulted in the beautiful things that these gentlemen just showed you. The music, the churches and cathedrals that Don said were at the center of the earliest cities. I think we have robbed ourselves enormously as a race worldwide, but especially in the agnostic and atheistic West. I think we've robbed ourselves of enchantment. Susie Gablick, a well-known art critic and philosopher, published a book in 1995-6 called The Re-Enchantment of Art, and it was a diatribe against modernism and the death of aesthetics through the overreach of form follows function, of naked, raw, brutal materials, and many other aspects that you're well aware of that characterize modernism. And the cost was a diverse human expression in detail, the filigree of imagination that people placed in and on their buildings for centuries, gone in a very short period of time. Her writing in some ways dovetails with my own experience with human beings in conflict zones around the world. I guess what I'm talking about is essentially human nature, that in the absence of enchantment, I'm going to use a generic word that almost anyone could accept, the existence of something transcending the material. In the absence of that, we rob ourselves of a dimension of imagination and a dimension of commitment and suffering to produce beauty that is not practical. There's got to be a reason to resist, and I'm saying that these are some of the reasons to resist. What we are not, what we have emptied ourselves of in a disenchanted, purely scientific world has caused us to build in a certain way. What we have built shapes us further, empties us further, bleaches us further. As a maker of things, small things, honestly, I've never employed more than one person. Mostly it's been just me. It's lonely, but I'm committed to it. And the kind of things that I've had the privilege to build, as I mentioned, some things that Andrew has designed, some in Charleston and other places in the United States that I've built, were my commitment to making something that I thought the world should have. Insignificant, maybe it's just Vince's front entrance, but my commitment was that the world needs this. There's something wondrous, there's something imaginative, there's something a childish delight in these things that needs to be in the world. Who doesn't like an underground fort or a tree house? Think about it. Someone referred to it this afternoon earlier that there are certain forms that we are fascinated by. You can be a minimalist, but at the same time you go into a catacomb or something, you go, wow, this is minimal in an enchanted way. This brings me to places that cause me to feel. Many places that I enter, and I'm very knowledgeable in architecture and art history, I walk into buildings that are considered monuments, and I'm cold in these buildings. I don't want to be in these buildings. Not merely because I'm a traditionalist, but because the sense of space, the massing, the use of materials, the lack of detail is not human. What do we like better than a story? Worldwide, we are fixated on stories. We read them. Social media is all about stories. Modern marketing is all about stories. Movies, books, we consume it. This is the detail of our social nature that fascinates us, and yet we build buildings that are devoid of narrative, that are devoid of associations, they're devoid of history. It's like celebrating divorce from our humanity. That's what I'm resisting, and I'm sorry, that sounds like I'm a preacher, but that's what I try to invest in each day that I set out to make things. And honestly, I'll just say, as a man of faith, I do pray in the morning, and I say, use this day. I know the sun's going to go down today, and that's an emblem that my life is shorter. And I have something to do, and I got to set out to do it. And honestly, just that prayer in the morning just reminds me there's a lot to accomplish, and it's a noble mission, even if you're alone or in a small group of people like this. And I just conclude by saying I admire you a lot for what you're doing. I feel like I'm way out of my depth having anything to say here tonight in the presence of so many great minds, but it's an honor to wake up in the day and say, I can make something today that's going to last. It's going to provide that feeling that I talked about to someone else. They walk in and they go, yes, this place ennobles me as a human. I feel better. Thank you.
Keep going. Steve.
I think it was Vince's question that you mentioned a while ago of what do we bring. And as someone who doesn't do regular architecture anymore, that's the one thing that I try to bring is to continue to ask questions even about things that are held in very high regard. like the term beauty, okay? And there's a couple of things that have bothered me about that for a very long time. And one is the fact of the reach, you might say. In other words, it is many people can spend a museum day seeing great beauty, but it does not change their life. They don't walk out of the museum saying, I will do something different tomorrow than I did yesterday. And there's an ancient adage that says, if I got this right, when Cicero speaks, the people applaud. When Demosthenes speaks, they get up and march. So the question is, what is the standard that we can use that will gauge whether we get up and march or not? I would suggest that the high standard is not beauty, because beauty can be merely appreciated with no change. The high standard is love, because love moves us to do different things, okay? It's kind of like the thing Andres mentioned earlier today about it's important that it be something that is enough to stir men's blood, or whatever the quote was. The build no small things quote. And so if you actually love something, you will change your life for it, if you really love it. And so that should be a higher standard. The other thing too is that in terms of whether you want to view the highest standard or the good standard, beauty is a good standard, but it's not the highest standard. If you want to, looking at either one of those, we talk about beauty as if it's a singular thing, okay? The fact of the matter is that on the vernacular to classical spectrum, or plain to fancy, or organic to refined, or however you want to characterize that, both ends of that spectrum, at the most vernacular end, someone will look at a very simple low-country cottage and say, isn't that charming? Okay, at the very high standard of a great work of art, they will look at that and they'll say, isn't that elegant? And then there's other settings in between charming and elegant. And so the interesting thing is, it's kind of like the transect. On the urban to rural transect, everyone can find their kind of sweet spot where they feel most at home on the transect. Also, on the transect of love, some people feel much more comfortable with things that are charming. Others feel, everybody finds their place. And so to speak of it as a singular thing is beauty, and not realize that actually there's a bunch of different settings, it kind of makes us dumb, because we're not really engaging all of the different settings at which people's hearts are moved to do something different in their life.
Do you have a response? Sure.
Well, sure. I wouldn't put beauty and love as two things you would pit against each other. Consider that beauty exists in its natural form quite without any need of us doing anything. In fact, I think to any designer, we are constantly put to shame by natural beauty. I know I am, that I'll spend all month designing something and I think I've designed the best thing ever, and then I'll go outside and I'll see a flower and I'll say, you know what, everything I've ever done is worthless compared to that. That's so much better. It is rightly humiliating. So it's not that the world needs us to create beauty. God put all the beauty the world could ever need there before us. But of course, love is what motivates us to want to do beauty. If we did not have love in our hearts, we wouldn't bother doing any of this beauty. And that applies to the monk as well as to the tyrant. The monks may be creating this liturgical beauty as a way of honoring God. They may be creating it because they love the world and they feel that this liturgical beauty supports their prayers for the world. The tyrant has some kind of love that's making him do it. It might be love of country, it might be love of glory and posterity. If he's the worst tyrant of all, it might be nothing but love for himself. But that's still a form of love that is motivating him to spend all this time and money on creating this beauty for the world. It is an absolutely critical motivation for any of this beauty to happen.
Let me throw one thing in real quick, and that is that I'm speaking, as I must, from within my own experience, and a part of that experience is writing a number of books that are intended to hopefully have people build things differently. And so from that perspective, I've got to look at what is it that will actually make someone change what they would have otherwise done. And so that's where I'm saying that if you can get to the standard of love, which does, now, beauty can create change, but love always creates change. If you really love someone or something, it will cause you to do something different than what you would have. So I'm saying that from the perspective of me trying to write things that will cause change.
So I want to add to what both of the gentlemen before me had to say, because as I go back to this headline of beauty as an act of resistance and thinking on why on earth would Vince want me to be on this panel? I curate programs, I conceive festivals that in and of itself, the statement when an all-black chamber orchestra comes on a stage is an act of resistance. I was involved with the Charleston Symphony for many, many years. Vince and I were on the board together at one point, and I started something called Gospel Christmas. If any of you know about it, Rodney remembers the Atlanta Symphony doing it. So a retired builder by the name of Wally Seinsheimer, many of you might know Dolphin Architects. My friend Christopher Isbin, I think, runs the company now. Wally approached me when I was on a community engagement committee to help the symphony expose classical music to underserved communities. And as I said earlier, I don't get involved with things that are not germane to change and it's going to affect somebody's life. And unbeknownst to me, I ended up meeting in Colony Square, of all places, in Atlanta with the Atlanta Symphony staff and kind of picking their brains about how they pull this thing off, because Charleston had never seen anything like this before. So Faith can relate to this, going to Portugal and singing in chorus and so forth. So if you remember, the Olympics had just happened in '96, and The Preacher's Wife movie with Denzel Washington and Whitney Houston was like one of the biggest soundtrack sales of all time. Like no soundtrack, I think Saturday Night Fever might have been up there and some others for those of us who were 70s and 80s kids. And so I came back here, introduced something to, I'm gonna give you the Reader's Digest, introduced it to the community, and 12 years into it, the symphony, like most regional orchestras, went bankrupt. The economy bottomed out. Everybody knew what the last couple of years of the Bush administration was like for the economics of the country. And so here I am trying to figure out my association with them. I have this community group. They're not performing. They are restructuring. But we have an active concert season, my chorus. And out of that came an idea when we did some highly arranged music that, wow, these community singers can actually do the masterworks. They could sing the Mozart Requiem. I mean, it was such a bold thing to do, to take these folks that don't read music and get them up to a place where you're actually performing the Mozart Requiem in St. Philip's Church on Church Street downtown. which then led to me going, the symphony asked me to do this outreach. I know all these conservatory trained musicians who can't get these covenant spots in the 1,500 orchestras in America. And so I sat down with a friend of mine and told her that, I wanted the board to understand that my contributions was beyond the toe tapping sounds of gospel. There was this evolution of black music that only on the continent of America did this form come to be. So we're very lucky about this intermingled history of white history and black history, that there was something that came out of it that is on par with when the first Italian opera was conceived in the 1600s, and that was the African American spiritual. Now, many of you probably don't know that the African American spiritual is the official song for the state of South Carolina. Think about that. This is where the Civil War started. This is where 40% of all Africans who came into the continent of North America came through Agis Wharf in that area. And so to go from a community engagement endeavor to taking a bold statement, an act of resistance, and saying to the world, my ancestry not only was at the table when classical music was being formed, we were the ones who played it for the folks who oppressed us. So for that reason, out of 1,700 now, orchestras in Canada and the United States are under what we call the League of American Orchestras. We're going to create this act of resistance to give those conservatory trained musicians a platform to perform not only the white European canon of music, but all those black composers like Chevalier de Saint-Georges, who was 11 years older than Amadeus Mozart, or Edmund Thornton Jenkins, who went to Avery Normal Institute on Bull Street, later to Morehouse College, was the first person to be the Morehouse Glee Club's, if anybody from Atlanta know the Glee Club is an institution at Morehouse, he was the first accompanist, and he spent time, graduated from the Royal Academy of Music with other noted black composers who get compared to Gustav Mahler, who were older than Mahler. So I think about Edmund, I think about Gershwin, and how many things that George Gershwin, who took DuBose Haywood's play of Porgy and turned it into the most iconic musical experience of the black Gullah Geechee experience that goes around the world, and that is Porgy and Bess. Guess where he got a lot of his melodies from? Edmund Thornton Jenkins, who was Father Jenkins, Joseph Jenkins, who started Jenkins Orphanage. I mean, for those of you who know this story, this is, when I started thinking about why in the hell would Vince want me to be there, I guess he says, you make some bold statements and you are a real act of resistance. So that is one of the things that I wanted to share that I think was related to this whole conversation.
Questions, folks? Yes, sir.
Thinking about beauty and in terms of Jesus, that's only the second time tonight I've done that. In terms of attainability, and the thing that might come to mind when you're talking about beauty is this, lavish, maybe expensive, unattainable sense, but really what I'm hearing from a lot of you, what you're talking about tonight, is a simple beauty, and it's something that you might find even in the mundane. And we've talked about this a lot today, and I've heard it last night, in particular from Andres, of the simple repetition, looking at the picture up here of the houses are in many ways just little boxes, but what makes them beautiful is the repetition of the porches and the simple differences, or here on this wall, the repetition of the paneling in the windows. But another thing that was mentioned today was we don't know what we want, or people don't know that they want or don't want something. And so we end up in these places that are inherently unbeautiful because they're not ugly, they're just poorly made, and we don't know the difference between well-made or made. And we might all, but the regular Americans that are just trying to buy a house, trying to find shelter, end up with something where they don't like where they live because they're badly made, but we have been sort of trained that beauty is unattainable because it's only for rich people, it's only for people who know better. But the simple textures or colors or materials that make something beautiful, we seem to not be able to have the grasp of in the everyday. And I'm curious from each or every one of you or any of you, how can we all make the beauty attainable, whether it's the simple porch detail that Andrew was showing, or that very simple house that Steve showed that was very beautiful but might not attract the first person to stop and say that is the most beautiful thing because it's minimal or simple. But how do we bring that beauty back to the attainability of the everyday person?
Let me answer that one first, and then I'll defer to you. You saw the buildings that we do. Did you think they're beautiful? They're all for the public, and it's very difficult to get them built. It's amazing to me in my hometown. We do them around the world, but my hometown is particularly tough to get that done. And we keep pressing on, and the people love it, and so we're not going to stop till we do the job.
Well, a big problem with the middle class aesthetically is that we can afford nice things, which makes us wish we could afford even nicer things. And the sort of false pretense of trying to reach for more than we can really hold tends to be a big part of the cause of the ugliness problem in bourgeois society. This was very specifically the problem with middle class ugliness that was remarked upon by William Morris and John Ruskin in the 19th century, that the peasants, their life was very beautiful because all of their aesthetic was completely within their means. And the aristocracy, their life was beautiful because they had splendid things and they could afford to do them splendidly. But the middle class would try to imitate the aristocracy, so they would buy things that were covered with ornament, but it was just machine-stamped ornament, and it was badly designed, and it came out of factories, and it had a particular species of pretentious ugliness that the world had not seen before maybe the 18th century. And this I think continues to be the biggest problem to this day. We always decry the McMansion phenomenon, where every middle class homeowner wants to have a house that's got 8 different gables and 4 different facade materials, and a really impressive front door with beveled glass in it, and sort of fake Rococo furniture and fake prints of fancy oil paintings, all this nonsense that, they're trying to look like much richer people than they are. And it's that overreach that is intrinsically ugly. I have this problem quite a lot with my church clients because Orthodox churches tend not to be very wealthy. It's usually a stretch for them to build any church. And they always come to me and say, our priority is that it's a copy of Hagia Sophia, and it has to have a giant dome, and it has to have marble columns, and we know that would, to do that authentically would cost $50 million. So can we do it out of steel and sheetrock and plastic and faux painting and a fiberglass onion dome with gold spray paint on the roof? And believe me, this is endemic with American Orthodox churches. You'll see a lot of that. And of course I tell people, that's completely the wrong path. The path to beauty is quality over quantity and beauty within your means. Find something that's humble enough that you can afford to do it authentically, and do that thing with simplicity and authenticity, and do it well. And in that, there will be great beauty. And it shouldn't be hard to imagine that, because we can look at old country chapels all over the place and see exactly that. We can see that in the 19th century, poor towns in America, you know, they would build a church for very little money, and it would be a little stick-framed box with lap siding and a few handmade windows, and it's painted white, and it's perfectly beautiful. You know, people will drive 2 hours to see it and take a photograph of it, and you could build that building today for like $150,000. So that I think is the key. Don't be pretentious. Don't overreach above your station and means. In fact, underreach. Think of something uncommonly simple that you can do and do it uncommonly well.
The greatest source of affordable housing in the history of human construction is the vernacular classical spectrum, and that is the farther down the spectrum you get towards the more vernacular, that has produced more affordability than anything else that has ever been built. And that basically is kind of the short version to the much more eloquent thing you just said.
Anybody? Oh, sorry, Andres.
Everybody's on the same side, and I think it deserves to, I think the other side deserves to not be cast as malevolent or stupid or ill-intentioned or wicked. For example, I see that there are two types of art. Everybody here is intent on an art of reform. We want to make the world better, okay? The artists that we don't like, that sometimes do, the best of them that do ugly things, like the artists after the First World War, who depicted the carnage and degeneration, were expressing society. There are two types of artists. There have always been those who try to reform society and those who express society. And they're also doing the same job. They're actually expressing the, whatever you want to call it, degeneracy, cynicism, etc. They're not stupid, okay? They're not all ill-intentioned. It's just, it's the other, and I learned this from Kurt Vonnegut, who said there are two types of artists, and they both have standing, and they're not necessarily in opposition, they just have different tools. And I understand, I always like to look at both sides of things because I'm confronted with both sides of things. I have to work with people who are Republicans and Democrats and modernists and not. And I try to understand their point of view, and I very seldom find evil. What I find is people that just have different priorities and different tools. And I wish there were more of that in this debate. But I also want to bring one other thing. Like, one of the things that's implied in everything that was said today is that we're somehow ineffective. I agree that the buildings of yours that I saw, even this paneling today, I have been just so enjoying this room that I can barely pay attention to what you guys are saying. Okay, I'm just going, oh my God, this is so beautiful. You know, I'm looking up. I don't really appreciate the air conditioning under my legs, but the rest is great. Okay. And I was thinking about, if this is so great, this chapel, why has it had such little effect? And I'm speaking, and why has Ion had so little effect? And I think that we're working in a media that today is quite ineffective. I saw a painting, I forget by whom, of a Greek artist painting, and the fans of painting were right behind the artist. The artist was sitting on a stool like this painting, and he had 3 and 4 young men looking and hanging onto every brushstroke. They couldn't wait to see the new painting. It was like seeing the outtakes of the new Star Wars. Oh my God, this painting's coming out. And they would actually put it behind a curtain and open the curtain, and people would crowd and trample each other to try to see the painting. We are not, I think, on the medium that is going to achieve what we're going to try to achieve. Movies have been invented. The kids have seen Star Wars. Are they really going to look at this panel and reform society? You see what I'm saying? Like, it's not our time to reform society through these. It might not even be a time to reform society through novels. Okay, there are now movies that exist, and God knows what else is coming up. And one of the things that I think is really lacking in the discussion of all new urbanists and traditionalists is this, they're megalomaniacs. in some like we are going to save the world. The new urbanists are going to save the world because we're such a good environmentalists, and we're going to save the world and the creatures within it everywhere and forever. Like what? What about just those few who are smart enough to buy here? You'll have a better life. You started real well. I came here and I had a better life. Thank you very much. We're grateful. But we always blow it up to saving the world, and it makes us anxious and unhappy. You know, let's just sort of, what Leo Creer calls, let's define our circle of happiness and kind of enjoy each other without having to reform, you know, to fix things that actually aren't fixable. Because right from the beginning, we were cast out of the Garden of Eden, and the devil had to be invented to explain shit, stupidity, and ugliness, okay? The devil is a construct that had to explain that which is unexplainable. And we're not gonna do it. So let's just settle down and be happy with what we do. I'm a great fan of Leo Creer's, define your circle of happiness and stay within it. That's what he does. He's never been happier. You know, he's a world-class reformer that eventually found the wisdom of finding his circle of happiness, and he's a happy camper now. So.
So I'm realizing why I like hanging out with Andres so much, rarely when I get to do that now, because everything you say makes me want to say something slightly different. But you bring up the point whether art's job is to be representative of decline or remedial to make us feel better in the face of decline, and that the two are equally legitimate, but I think that changes when you talk about architecture, and certainly when you talk about city planning, where there's a social responsibility, and also a sense that you're not just an art, you're a profession. And like law, which is based on a foundation of former law, or medicine, which is, you know, we're not bleeding patients anymore because we've learned not to do that, we have a certain responsibility as professionals to make people's lives better. So that distinguishes the building, or certainly the town, from the painting. But in the interest of a lively dinner, I do want to say, like, I wasn't interested in architecture and wasn't moved by architecture when I lived in a house with windows like this, beautiful windows. But when I moved into a house by an apprentice of Gropius's at age 7, with 8-foot sheets of glass and beautiful minimalist heavy timber construction, that's when I fell in love with beauty and architecture. So I do want to posit that there are different aesthetics, and that anything done with care in any number of eras can still be beautiful.